Most Americans do not think about fertilizer when they walk into a grocery store. They think about the price of eggs, cereal, meat, bread, milk, and the weekly total at checkout. But before any of those products reach a shelf, another bill has already been paid somewhere else. It is paid on the farm. In 2026, one of the most important farm costs in America has become harder to ignore: fertilizer. It is not something most households buy directly. It does not appear on a grocery receipt, but it sits near the beginning of the food supply chain. And when the cost of fertilizer rises, it can put pressure on farmers long before consumers see the result. That does not mean fertilizer automatically raises grocery prices by itself. Food prices are affected by many forces: labor, fuel, transportation, packaging, weather, retail costs, global trade, and more. But verified data shows fertilizer has become one of the pressure points inside America's food system. The food system does not begin at the supermarket. It begins months earlier, with planting decisions. According to USDA data released on March 31, 2026, American farmers intended to plant 95.3 million acres of corn. That was down 3% from 2025. At the same time, soybean growers intended to plant 84.7 million acres. That was up 4%. Those numbers matter because corn is more fertilizer intensive than soybeans, especially when it comes to nitrogen fertilizer. So when fertilizer becomes expensive, it can influence the economics of what farmers choose to plant. Before food becomes a product, it is a crop. Before it becomes a crop, it is a planting decision. And before that planting decision is made, farmers are looking at costs: seed, fuel, equipment, land, labor, interest, fertilizer. USDA's data does not say fertilizer was the only reason farmers intended to plant less corn and more soybeans. That would be too simple. But the research shows fertilizer prices were already part of the pressure around those planting decisions. Reuters reported that high fertilizer costs were a major factor analysts were watching before USDA released the planting numbers. Then, later in May, Reuters reported that the Federal Trade Commission had opened an industry-wide investigation into rising fertilizer prices. The investigation is not proof of wrongdoing. It is not a conclusion, and it is not a final finding. But it shows that fertilizer prices had become important enough to draw federal scrutiny. The numbers were significant. Reuters reported that urea prices had risen 55%, based on Kentucky Farm Bureau testimony. Other nitrogen fertilizer prices were reported up 33%. For farmers, those are not abstract percentages. They are operating costs. They are bills that arrive before the crop is harvested and long before shoppers decide what they can afford at the grocery store. A fertilizer price increase puts pressure on a farm budget. That pressure affects crop margins. Crop margins can affect planting decisions. Planting decisions affect the supply of key crops. Those crops move into animal feed, food manufacturing, grocery products, and eventually household budgets. The movement is not immediate. It is not always direct. But it is connected closely enough that USDA, BLS, companies, regulators, and news agencies are tracking the pressure from different parts of the system. USDA's Economic Research Service forecast farm production expenses at $477.7 billion for 2026. That is the broad cost base facing the farm sector. At the same time, USDA forecast net farm income at $153.4 billion, down 0.7% from 2025. Together, those figures show the basic tension. Farm costs remain high. Farm income is under pressure, and farmers must make decisions before ordinary consumers see the consequences. This is not only a story about farmers. It is also a story about the early stages of household food costs. Grocery inflation is what families actually feel. BLS reported that food-at-home prices were up 2.7% year over year in May 2026. That is the grocery category, the part of inflation people see when they buy food for the week. Inside that category, fruits and vegetables were up 6.1%. Non-alcoholic beverages were up 5.8%. Cereals and bakery products were up 1.9%. Meats, poultry, fish, and eggs were up 1.8%. Those grocery numbers cannot be blamed on fertilizer alone. That would be misleading. But they show the consumer side of the same system. Food costs were still rising for households, while farm input costs were also under pressure upstream. The grocery bill is not one problem. It is a chain of costs. Fertilizer is one of the earliest. For many consumers, the food supply chain is mostly invisible. A cereal box appears on a shelf. A loaf of bread appears in an aisle. A package of meat appears in the refrigerated case. Behind those products are farms, inputs, processors, transporters, wholesalers, and retailers. Each layer carries costs. And when costs build across several layers at once, the pressure becomes harder for households to avoid. Fertilizer sits near the beginning because crops need nutrients before they can become food, feed, or ingredients. Nitrogen fertilizer is especially important for corn. Corn is not only eaten directly, it moves through the food system in other ways. It can be used in animal feed. It can be used in processed food ingredients. It can influence other parts of the agricultural economy. So when the economics of corn planting change, the effects can move through more than one channel. The data does not prove a simple one-to-one relationship. A fertilizer price increase today does not guarantee a grocery price increase tomorrow. But the system is connected, and that connection is what makes the issue important. CF Industries, a major U.S. nitrogen fertilizer producer, reported first quarter 2026 net sales of $1.99 billion. A year earlier, the figure was $1.66 billion. The company said average selling prices were higher across all segments. It pointed to tight global nitrogen supply and conflict-related disruptions. CF's chief executive said the conflict had further constrained global nitrogen supply and exposed the fragile nature of the global nitrogen supply chain. That statement shows the company view of the market. From the company side, the price pressure was tied to supply tightness and disruption. From the regulator side, the FTC opened an investigation into rising fertilizer prices. From the farmer side, higher fertilizer costs raise the cost of planting. From the consumer side, grocery prices are still rising. Each group sees a different part of the same chain. None of those perspectives, by itself, explains the whole story. The government data view is that planting intentions shifted. Corn acres were expected to fall. Soybean acres were expected to rise. The company view is that nitrogen fertilizer supply was tight and disrupted. The regulator view is that fertilizer prices rose sharply enough to investigate. The consumer data view is that grocery prices were still higher than a year earlier. Together, those facts point to a pressure point. Not a prediction, not a guarantee, a pressure point. This matters for middle-class households because food is not optional. Families can delay buying a new car. They can put off a vacation. They can avoid some discretionary spending. But groceries have to be bought again and again, every week, every month. When food costs rise slowly across many categories, households feel it through the budget. A few dollars more for produce, a few dollars more for drinks, a little more for cereal, a little more for meat. Individually, each increase may not seem dramatic. Together, they change what a household can afford. That is why upstream farm costs matter. Not because every farm cost becomes a grocery price immediately, but because food prices are built from layers, and fertilizer is one of those layers. For farmers, the pressure is different but connected. They face costs before they know what the final market will give them. They decide what to plant before the crop is harvested. They buy inputs before they sell output. If fertilizer prices rise, the risk changes. If fuel prices rise, the risk changes again. If crop prices do not rise enough to offset those costs, margins tighten. USDA's forecast of farm production expenses at $477.7 billion shows the size of that cost base. It is not one bill. It is the total operating pressure across the farm sector. And in a year when net farm income is forecast to decline slightly, higher input costs become more important. This is where ordinary people and producers meet inside the same economy. Farmers face the cost first. Consumers may feel parts of it later. The connection is not always visible, but it is there. The question is not whether fertilizer alone will raise grocery bills. The question is, how much pressure can build inside the food system before it shows up in prices households already struggle to absorb? The timeline shows how the pressure developed. In early 2026, USDA forecast farm income and expenses. By late March, USDA reported planting intentions showing less corn and more soybeans. In May, CF Industries reported higher selling prices and higher net sales. Later in May, Reuters reported the FTC investigation into rising fertilizer prices. And in June, BLS reported that grocery prices were still up 2.7% from a year earlier. Those events do not form a simple straight line, but they do show several pressures appearing in the same food cost system: farm costs, planting decisions, fertilizer company pricing, regulatory scrutiny, household food inflation. That is the hidden system behind the story. It is not one company. It is not one agency. It is not one crop. It is the cost structure behind food. When that cost structure tightens, the effects can move slowly. They can move unevenly. They can show up in different categories at different times. But for households, the result is familiar. The grocery bill stays heavy. The receipt gets longer. The budget gets tighter. And the reason is often not visible from the checkout line. That is why the next reports matter. USDA acreage updates will show whether planting intentions changed after spring conditions developed. BLS food-at-home data will show whether grocery inflation continues, cools, or shifts across categories. USDA's food price outlook will help show how official analysts view food price pressure. The FTC investigation may show whether regulators find evidence behind the fertilizer price concerns. And company earnings from fertilizer producers will show whether tight supply and pricing pressure continue. Those are the facts to watch, not rumors, not panic, not predictions. Data. The responsible way to tell this story is to separate what is known from what remains uncertain. What is known is that fertilizer prices became a major concern in 2026. What is known is that USDA reported a shift in planting intentions. What is known is that farm production expenses remain high. What is known is that grocery prices were still higher than a year earlier. What is known is that the FTC opened an investigation into fertilizer prices. What remains uncertain is how much of this pressure will reach consumers, how long it will last, and which grocery categories will be affected most. That uncertainty matters because household budgets are already exposed to many pressures at once. Groceries, gas, rent, mortgages, insurance, electric bills, debt payments. For middle-class households, the issue is not one shocking number. It is the accumulation of costs. That is why a hidden farm cost matters. A fertilizer bill paid months before harvest can become part of a larger economic chain. From energy markets to fertilizer plants, from farms to crops, from food manufacturers to grocery stores, and finally, to the family standing at the checkout counter. The fertilizer market is not the grocery bill, but it can be one of the forces behind it. In 2026, that force is under pressure. Farmers are facing high production expenses. Fertilizer prices have risen sharply enough to draw federal attention. Major fertilizer companies have reported higher selling prices. USDA data shows a shift in intended crop acres, and American households are still paying more for groceries than they did a year earlier. The outcome is not certain, but the pressure is real. For families trying to make a weekly budget work, the hidden costs at the beginning of the food chain are worth watching long before they appear on the receipt.